Good afternoon. My name is Greg Ball. I have the privilege of being the Dean of the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences, and I want to welcome all of you to today's Sadat Forum, which is on a topic that couldn't be more important to the future of our country, the topic being America and the Middle East. How did we get here, and where do we go from here? I want to start my remarks by just saying a few words about one of the holders of our 3 peace chairs who recently passed away. As you know, the Anwar Sadat chair is one of 3 chairs dedicated to peace and development we have in the college. One is the Baha'i chair, and the other is the George and Lisa Zakim Khalil Gibran chair. Suhail Bashroui, who held that chair, recently passed away, and I think we should just note the fact that we lost such a wonderful man dedicated to peace who brought a cultural sophistication and a sensitivity to issues which really broaden students' lives for many years here at the University of Maryland, and we will miss him very much. We will be having a memorial service for him here on campus, and I'll make sure everyone is informed of that. Today, we are privileged to have a very distinguished visitor, Ambassador William J. Burns, who is now the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. But previous to that, he had a stellar career in the Department of State, most recently as Deputy Secretary of State. I think it's interesting to note the comment President Obama made concerning Secretary Burns. Since I took office, I have relied on him for candid advice and sensitive diplomatic missions. He has been a skilled advisor, consummate diplomat, and inspiration to a generation of public servants. Secretary of State John Kerry went so far as to say that Ambassador Burns is on the short list of American diplomatic legends. He's had a very distinguished career working under both Republican and Democratic administrations equally effectively in handling many of the most sensitive and difficult problems our country has faced. I think I, like all of you, am looking forward to hearing the conversation he'll be having with Professor Shibley Telhami. Professor Telhami, as you know, is the holder of the Anwar Sadat Chair for Peace and Development. He also has had a distinguished career since coming to the University of Maryland from Cornell. He has been a powerhouse in running programs such as this one today that brings to our campus discussions and encounters with some of the most important issues facing our country in the diplomatic world, with a focus on the Middle East. As a social scientist, he's one of the few people who genuinely assesses public opinion in the Middle East from all perspectives, and his data-driven discussions are a breath of fresh air on a field which is filled with people who sometimes take opinions in the absence of data. I am very pleased that we're having this symposium here today and look forward to hearing it. I would now like to introduce President Wallace Lowe from the University of Maryland, College Park.
Thank you very much, Dean Ball, and welcome everyone to this year's Sadat Forum. This is a very special occasion because this chair honors the legacy of former Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, and his contributions and sacrifice in the name of peace resonate with special force on this day, October the 6th, 34 years ago, when assassins took his life. And the holder of this chair, and the one who over the years have brought to this campus some of the most penetrating world leaders and policymakers, including 3 former secretaries of state, 3 presidents of this country, and a United Nations Secretary General. And his writings and media appearances here and throughout the Middle East have fulfilled his mission of public education. And his extensive research, especially the use of public opinion polling in the region and in the United States, have identified trends, shaped policy discussions, and promoted public understanding. He is, of course, Professor Shibley Telhami. So thank you, Shibley, for all that you've done on behalf of the chair. And today we are privileged to see the view from the mountaintop, looking both forward and backward by the former Deputy Secretary of State, William Burns, who has done so much throughout his career to shape American policy. So please join me in welcoming Professor Telhami and our special guest, Ambassador Burns.
Thanks so much, President Lowe and Dean Ball. Bill, let me add my voice of welcome to you to University of Maryland. I think of the 33 years that you served in government, I've known you for at least 25 years. And I can say, you know, as someone who's been around Washington for all these years, that I don't think that I've ever encountered a person who's got such universal respect in a very divided city that has become very, very partisan. And I know from working with you and consulting with you over very difficult issues over the years, that had our government fully listened to your advice, we wouldn't be anywhere near in trouble as we are right now. So thank you for all your service. Thank you for serving the country. And thank you for being a friend all these years.
Thanks. No, you're very kind, Shibley, and it truly is an honor to be here at Maryland this afternoon. Honor to be sitting on the same stage with Shibley Telhami, someone whom I've admired greatly over the years, and an honor to be at the Sadat Forum. My introduction to the Middle East and diplomacy was in Anwar Sadat's Egypt. I had just turned 18 in the summer of 1974, and one of my best friends in high school was the son of the then American ambassador in Cairo. We had just restored relations after the October 73 war. His name was Herman Isles.
A little bit up.
Oh,
maybe.
sorry. Is that better? And so I spent 3 months in the summer of 1974 in Egypt, and you know, it was really my first connection to the Middle East and to diplomacy. In fact, I remember at one point that summer, Ambassador Isles had to deliver a message to President Sadat. We were in Alexandria on the Mediterranean, and so we drove out. Sadat, you know, ever the gentleman, invited the whole family to come out to lunch. And so this was at a presidential guest house to the west of Alexandria on the Mediterranean. And, you know, after the ambassador and President Sadat did their diplomatic business, we had lunch for a couple hours, and not about high policy. Certainly at 18, I had nothing to contribute on those issues. But, you know, a very kind of genial conversation about history, about Egypt, about families. And, you know, it made a huge impression on me at 18. And, you know, in many respects, I think my interest in the Middle East and certainly my interest in diplomacy flowed from that. So I owe a lot to Anwar Sadat, and it's a particular privilege to be here for the forum.
Well, and you've done so much work on Egypt, including a dissertation that was turned into a book and more since, obviously, on that issue. I'm going to revisit that a little bit. But before I ask you about specific questions, I'd like to ask you a broader question, which is, you know, basically your experience. You've just left the State Department. You've been there for 33 years. You're only the second or third career diplomat to ever become deputy secretary, which normally is a political appointment. You have spent so much of that time in the Middle East or working on the Middle East, obviously beyond that as well. And just want you to reflect a little bit. Sort of, are there lessons that you would draw from all these years that you've worked on this issue?
Sure, I'd be glad to. I mean, I'm still waiting for my dissertation about Egypt to become a TV movie, so I think I'm going to be waiting a long time. But yeah, I mean, as I think back on, you know, I spent most of my overseas career either in the Middle East or in Russia, two nice, boring parts of the world. But as I reflect on the Middle East and American strategy, I mean, I guess I'd offer, for what little there were, 3 or 4 lessons, most of which I think American diplomats have learned the hard way in the Middle East. The first and most obvious is humility. The Middle East is a place, as many of you know, where skeptics are hardly ever wrong, where pessimists, you know, rarely lack for company or validation. The Middle East is a place which is hard sometimes for Americans to understand, and that is, it's a place where it's not all about us. You know, other people and other societies have their own realities, not always hospitable to the ones that Americans have. And that doesn't mean, I don't think, that Americans need to accept or indulge those perspectives, but the starting point for sensible policy is to understand them. Another source of humility is the reality that, at least in my experience, change in the Middle East is rarely neat or linear. It sometimes can be cruel and messy and deeply unpredictable in its second and third order consequences. Middle East is also a place where there's a huge reservoir of mistrust of the United States, of American motives. I've always thought Americans, especially in government, get way more credit than we deserve in the Middle East for complicated conspiracies. But hubris for Americans and American diplomacy can be a really shaky starting place. And so humility, and by that I don't mean passivity or inaction, but at least an understanding of the landscape that you have to navigate, is a really important first lesson. Second, and more briefly, the Middle East still matters. It's very tempting for all of us as American citizens, and for people from lots of other parts of the globe, as you look at the history of the last 10 or 15 years, for Americans, two very long, painful, protracted conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, a kind of trail of frustrations away from most of the major issues in the Middle East. It's very tempting to want to pivot in another direction. And the truth is that if you look at other parts of the globe, the Asia Pacific, which is, in many respects the center of gravity in the global economy, you look at the reality that the United States, at least, is not as directly dependent on energy resources in the Middle East as we were some decades ago. You look at the reality, and I say this carefully because recent Russian military deployments have created some risk in this regard, but I do think today there's less of a danger, certainly than there was in Anwar Sadat's time, of a great power or superpower conflict in the Middle East than there was then. But at the same time, I don't think we as Americans can afford to neglect the Middle East either. The Middle East energy still matters to the global economy, even if we're less directly dependent on it. It's still, we still have a stake in safe access to energy in the Middle East. Problems, instability, fragilities in the Middle East don't stay in the Middle East. They tend to spill over. That's what European Union members are wrestling with now in terms of what is a terrible challenge of migration and refugees and displaced people on the move. So there are lots of reasons why American governments in this administration and beyond it need to pay attention to the Middle East. Third, I think it's really important to understand that order in the Middle East is not one-dimensional. There's a temptation, and I was as guilty of this as anybody in government, to see what is an understandable short-term need for security and see, authoritarian leaderships that can provide that sometimes more readily than others, but to miss the reality that stability is not a static phenomenon, and that over the long run, if you want to see order in the Middle East, of course you have to see security, you have to see a balance of power amongst regional players so there's no hegemon emerging, but you also have to see a sense of economic opportunity emerging and a sense in which people can realize political dignity, which matters as much to people across the Middle East as it does in this country or any place else. And you also have to see a respect for pluralism begin to emerge over time and become institutionalized, because without that, there's no way in which multi-sectarian, multi-ethnic societies can hold together. Now that's a lot easier said than done. It's not something for which there are answers in Washington. Those answers have to come from people and leaders in the region, and you don't have a lot of leaders like Anwar Sadat in the Middle East today. But I think it's important for Americans not to be fatalistic about this either, because there are things in the long run that the United States can do to contribute to that kind of a more stable and more orderly outcome in terms of contributions to economic modernization. Lots of societies, especially in the Arab world, that thirst for modernization of educational systems, creating more open markets and encouraging more open trading systems in the region, because the dirty little secret is that Arab states don't trade much with one another today. So there are things that the United States can do in the long run. And in the short term, I think it's really important for, in terms of American strategy, and this is kind of the last lesson I'd offer, to think about ways in which you can amplify or reinforce models of success, or at least countries which are beginning to evolve in a more stable and hopeful direction, whether it's in Tunisia, an example of a post-revolutionary society that is doing a lot of the right things in terms of developing a political habit of compromise. In Jordan, a monarchy that faces lots of challenges but is trying to evolve itself ahead of pressures for change. The United Arab Emirates, which is blessed with more resources, but also I think has a pretty sensible leadership that's looking at ways in which it can also stay ahead of waves of change. And then last but not least, as you think of lessons in terms of American strategy and what we can do in the short run, is to limit the dangers and the risks to order. And that's the category in which I think the Iranian nuclear agreement falls. It's not as if that nuclear agreement is going to transform Iranian behavior across the Middle East, make it any less supportive of Hezbollah or the Houthis in Yemen, or any less of a disruptive force in the short run. That's not going to change, at least in my opinion, overnight. But if you added either a nuclear-armed Iran or an unconstrained nuclear program in Iran to that list of fragilities and chaos that I mentioned before, I think you have an even bigger problem of disorder in the Middle East. And so to be able to limit and prevent that problem from adding to that list of chaotic factors, I think is a useful contribution on the part of the United States and others. So I've now demonstrated I haven't lost the State Department bureaucrats' ability to speak at great length. And I promise my rest of my answers will be shorter. But those are 3 or 4 lessons I think I've learned over the years.
I appreciate these broad reflections, and I'm going to come back to the Iran issue because I know you ended there and it's a very important issue, and I'm going to revisit that, and I'm going to revisit the Syria issue. But I want to start with you, not where you started 33 years ago when you started your career, but rather with 9/11. And 9/11 because obviously it has changed the relationship between the U.S. and the Middle East in a big way. And it's also because that's when you started kind of a new phase in your career, because you came from Jordan just before 9/11 when you served as ambassador. I remember you and I had dinner together at your residence in Jordan after Secretary Powell had called you and asked you to become Assistant Secretary for the Middle East. And that summer, just before 9/11, we worked closely together on a number of issues. And I want to say here for the first time, just to tell you how much of a friend of the University of Maryland Bill was during that period, that just before the tragedy of 9/11, as you know, this was a big tragedy for us here because that was a period also when we experienced a tornado on campus that killed a lot of people. It was a very, very difficult fall. But I remember just before 9/11, it may have been the day before or a couple of days before, I got a phone call from Assistant Secretary Burns, and in my office, I was sitting in my office in College Park, and he said, I would like you to pencil in the following day in September, but don't share it with anybody, not even the president of the university at this point, that Secretary Powell is going to give you a Sadat lecture with a major speech on the Arab-Israeli issue. And of course, we know what happened the next day. And that speech changed dramatically and then became the Kentucky speech, I think, at that point. But appreciated your effort. What a tragedy. It did alter our relationship. So I want to ask you a couple of questions related to that period. One, we have, as you know, we're a university and we have a lot of students, undergraduates and graduates, who grapple with American foreign policy. They want to understand. A lot of people don't understand how we can get into the trouble we get into thinking that maybe if I go there and give them advice, and we all know that the U.S. government is full of excellent thinkers and people who really know and experts. It's not that we're hungry for it. So typically people want to understand, how do we get ourselves in these kind of messes? And so I want to start with a question about Secretary Powell himself, not so much about him as a president. I know you respect him, a lot of people did, but in historical perspective, when you look at him, he was the most popular man in the Bush administration, remained so throughout the Bush administration, started that way, ended that way. So he's a major American with a lot of accomplishments. He becomes the Secretary of State of the United States. And his voice is not central. He had a voice, undoubtedly. He's a big, important man. But American policy went in a direction that wasn't what he would have chosen. How is this possible?
Well, I have enormous respect for Colin Powell. I think he was a terrific leader, and I learned as much from him as from anybody else I ever worked for about, what makes for a good leader. I think after 9/11, for all of us as Americans, it was a terrible jolt. The fact that we were vulnerable to that kind of an attack. I think the initial impulse was exactly the right one, which was to deal, I think, quite effectively with the challenge posed by the fact that Afghanistan had become a platform for al-Qaeda. And I think, but beyond that, I think there was sort of a huge self-consciousness about ensuring that this would never happen again, which was not just about homeland security and what you do here, but about looking in a different way against threats that were perceived in the Middle East. I thought at the time that, that it also created a number of opportunities for the United States, because there was this huge outpouring, I think, if not sympathy may not be the right word, but of, support for the United States. And so beyond Afghanistan, it just seemed to me it was an opportunity to engage on the Palestinian-Israeli issue and a range of other issues in the region, some of which I talked about before, that would get at some of those deeper drivers of disaffection and disorder in the Middle East. Some of you may remember the Arab Human Development Reports, which were written by Arab scholars and came out roughly in this period. And I reread them about 2 or 3 months ago, and they're actually just as compelling today as they were then about the deficits that were identified in knowledge and educational opportunity and economic possibilities and women's rights, a whole range of issues. And I think, we came off course a good bit after that initial, sort of unification of the country and what was accomplished in Afghanistan, and then got sucked in very quickly to Iraq.
Is it, I'm thinking about it institutionally. Is it that, the president was closer in his views to others than he was to the secretary, so the president was the tipping voice, he was not just a passive recipient? Is it that after 9/11, by default, the Department of Defense role is elevated because we're at war? Anytime you're at war, they become central, and therefore the Secretary of Defense becomes central, and diplomacy takes a back seat. Or is it something else? That's...
Well, I think all those are factors, Shibley. I agree with you. I think also there was a sense, and we had some pretty harsh debates within that administration in the first term over a lot of these issues too, which shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. But I think there was a sense on the part, not so much Powell, but others in the administration, that it was essential for the United States to assert itself in the Middle East and demonstrate to people in that region that we were determined to root out any threats that might develop well beyond Afghanistan. And I think that impulse led us down some very complicated roads. And you look back in hindsight, I had a lot of respect for 3 or 4 colleagues in the State Department who resigned, in the run-up to the Iraq War in the spring of 2003, because they just felt in good conscience that they, couldn't support that. We tried, I was surrounded by some very fine diplomats in the Near East Bureau in that era working for Powell. Ryan Crocker was one of my deputies, David Satterfield, some others, and we tried as honestly as we could to lay out, some of the challenges that lay ahead and try to puncture at least some of the rosier assumptions. And then I remember Secretary Powell asked me one day, first thing in the morning, to try to look ahead at everything that could go wrong if we followed through with the war in Iraq in the spring of 2003. So a couple of colleagues of mine who did most of the work on this, but Ryan Crocker was one of them, spent all day. And I remember about 8 o'clock at night, Secretary Powell called down and said, okay, so where's the paper? We were on about page 18, I think. And we called it The Perfect Storm. And I reread that one again a few months ago, and we got it about half right. in terms of identifying, some of the unforeseen consequences when you took the lid off a society that was really complicated, and the things that you had to worry about in terms of big external players outside Iraq trying to take advantage of chaos there. So we didn't get it all right, but it was at least an honest attempt to do what we thought we were obliged to do, which was, anticipate some of the problems that we later ran into.
So one question related to that, I mean, if you're reflecting back on it and you're looking back at paths not taken, what may have been missed opportunities. Obviously, in a crisis of that sort could have gone in many different ways. And one of them had to do with the war on terrorism. I know initially that the Department of State's position was we should focus on terrorist groups, quote, that have global reach, rather than a blanket war on terrorism. And so when you reflect back on that, was that something that would have mattered as you look back at it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it mattered in the sense that Al-Qaeda was an obvious threat. They had just demonstrated their lethality to Americans. And so there was simply no substitute for the most, rigorous possible war against Al-Qaeda. And I think very methodically, it took a decade to get bin Laden, but I think very methodically the US government went about that. But as I said, I think we then detoured in some directions that, cost us enormously in terms of blood and treasure, and, inadvertently, I think, contributed to the chaos and the disorder that already existed in some of those societies. So, history, when you look in the rearview mirror, is almost always, in my experience, full of, moments that now look clearer than they did at the time. But I think, it's been a pretty grim history in the Middle East, by and large, since that period.
Now, if you look back again at that period, before I get into the next issue, I want to transition a little bit toward the Arab-Israeli issue. And I want to transition there because, if you recall, 9/11 doesn't happen in a vacuum, obviously. It happens while we had total failure of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations in 2000. We had the second intifada, the Palestinian uprising, that was bloody. And this was the rise of Arab satellites, so it's being magnified by the media. And so there's tremendous anger with the US long before 9/11 happens. And to my mind, it's interesting that our discourse about that was, did the Arab-Israeli issue cause the terrorists to attack America? Well, that was not really the central question. Because I think Al-Qaeda had its own aims, it may have connected it to the Arab-Israeli issue, but that wasn't the central issue. The question that I want to ask you is different, which is, imagine that we actually succeeded in creating two states in 2000 at Camp David. And then we had an Arab coalition backing our diplomacy to make it work, both Israelis, Arabs, and American diplomacy. And everybody invested in making it work against militants. How would the reaction have been in the region after 9/11?
Yeah, I think it would have put us in a much more solid place. Now, again, that's another of those issues that's easier talked about than actually solved, because as Sadat himself demonstrated, and as Yitzhak Rabin did, as King Hussein in Jordan did, leadership in the region matters enormously. And that's rare enough in the history of the last few decades. But I continue to believe, just as I believed at the time, that a two-state solution is deeply in the interests of both Palestinians and Israelis and of the wider region. If the root of the Arab Spring, Arab Awakening, Arab revolutions, whatever you want to call it, was a sense of indignity on the parts of lots of people in those societies, nothing cuts more to that sense of indignity, I think, amongst Palestinians and amongst at least some other Arabs, than the absence of movement toward a Palestinian state. And I think nothing, honestly, cuts more to the core of, Israel's long-term security interests than trying to produce, through a painful process of negotiations, a two-state solution. I just think it's wrong to conclude, as some people did when they looked at Tahrir Square in January, February of 2011, and didn't see a lot of people holding up signs criticizing Israel, condemning Israel, or supporting Palestinians, that, okay, maybe this issue doesn't matter so much anymore. I think that's a misreading of history, and I think both for demographic reasons, you know, as the Palestinian population and the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, the Palestinian and Arab population increases. Ideology is a factor in the sense that you're going to see a younger generation that almost inevitably is going to get more radicalized over time. And technology is a factor too, in the sense that, you know, even the best and most sophisticated Israeli missile defenses like Iron Dome, to which the United States has contributed a lot, rightfully, you know, as time goes on, technological advances can, you know, undermine those kind of defenses. So for all those reasons, as difficult as the issue is, I think it's wrong to conclude that it doesn't matter so much anymore.
Well, in that spirit, if you look back at American administrations' policy toward this region, you know, most don't really want to deal with it. They come in not wanting to deal with it because they know the experience, except the Obama administration, had a different approach.
Well, and even administrations that ended up dealing with it, I think quite effectively, didn't start out that way. I remember Secretary Baker, when I worked for him, and I have enormous respect for him. He's a wonderful negotiator. But the first year and a half or so he was secretary, you know, he didn't want to touch the issue because there was too much else going on in the world, and he didn't see the possibility for movement. But then, shrewd person that he is, he understood after Desert Storm that there was a moment when, you know, United States leverage and the potential for American leadership was enormous, and he turned that moment through sheer persistence into the Madrid Peace Summit in the fall of 1990 or 1991. And you know, people forget he has outside of his wall, his office in Houston, a whole set of cartoons from that period that basically made fun of the first 8 of the 9 trips he took to the Middle East before Madrid, with people saying, yeah, he's just wasting his time, this isn't going to work. So persistence matters in addition to vision and diplomacy, and I think Baker demonstrated in that period. Others did as well. President Carter certainly did, you know, when he produced Camp David and the Egypt-Israel peace treaty. But, you know, there are examples of that, but they didn't always start sort of fully born on people's first day in office.
Well, that's true, and yet there is, and that's true of every administration, really, you go through the record, but there is a sense, though, now, that given what's happening elsewhere in the region, you know, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Iraq, you know, everywhere you look, that the issue has become so marginalized even within the region that it may not ever become center stage for the next president. Is that your perception, or what is it going to depend on?
It may not. I mean, it could depend on, you know, the one kind of encouraging dynamic, it seems to me, is that you do have some key Arab states that are spending more time for a variety of reasons talking to the Israelis. And it's at least conceivable to me that you could make some progress in a sense from the outside in other words, with some key Arab states, including Saudi Arabia and Gulf states, playing a more active role in trying to promote an atmosphere in which it becomes clear to Israelis, you know, what a two-state solution could lead to in terms of acceptance in the region. I think Arab states have oftentimes underestimated. This is something Sadat understood very clearly, but Arab states, by and large, have often underestimated the impact that they can have on Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. So that's the one area that I think could hold some encouragement as you look to a new administration.
Now, I don't really want to get into details of the Iraq war because it's a big issue. We don't want to open it. As you know my view on this, I think it's probably the most disastrous event for U.S. policy over the past decade and a half, and probably more than any other event has transformed the Middle East for the worse, in my own view. If you care to comment, I invite you to,
no,
but
I mean,
I want to move to another issue. But
I think it was a mistake, is the honest answer. And it's not as if you can trace every fragility, every problem in the Middle East to that. I don't think you can. But just in terms of American interest and the amount of the hundreds of billions of dollars that we spent, the number of American lives that were lost, or Americans who were maimed as a result of that war, not to mention tens of thousands of Iraqis as well. And I'm not trying to suggest that, you know, Saddam Hussein's Iraq left people better off. It was a horrific place. But I do believe it was a mistake.
We'll leave it at that, because I'll come back a little bit when I talk about ISIS, but I want to ask you a little bit more about the more recent events, starting with the Arab uprisings. I know that pretty much everyone was surprised when first Ben Ali was overthrown in Tunisia, but certainly when Mubarak was overthrown in Egypt. I remember having conversations with you on these issues during that period. None of us saw it coming. It happened very quickly. In retrospect, when you look at how the Obama administration handled it, just both as a broad phenomenon or country to country, what do you think the administration did right? What do you think the administration did wrong?
I mean, I think you almost have to take it case by case, because I don't think, while you can draw some broad lessons about, the Arab awakening and what happened in that, crucial few months in early 2011 through 2012, there's not any one kind of neat paradigm or one-size-fits-all explanation of how each society evolved and dealt with those pressures. So in Egypt, there are a lot of our longtime partners in the Gulf felt that the United States had kind of prematurely thrown Hosni Mubarak under the bus. My own view is that I think the bus had already started moving, and I think President Mubarak, for human reasons I suppose you can understand, had failed to react in time. And so I think, while I'm not a big fan of the kind of Roman Colosseum style of diplomacy where the United States thinks it has to pronounce itself up or down on every leader in the world, I think we get ourselves in difficulty oftentimes with that. I think with regard to Mubarak and Egypt, because of our particular relationship with Egypt and because of a genuine concern on the part of the president and Secretary Clinton and others at that time about trying to encourage a transition that would have as little bloodshed and lead to a stable and outcome as possible. I think it was the right thing to openly encourage Mubarak to step down. I think in response to, I think we did a fair job in this administration of trying to shore up and encourage some other societies who felt the same pressures to try to reform their way ahead of those pressures. I think Syria's been a god-awful mess. And I think it's one of the most difficult things in government sometimes I always found is weighing the risks of action against the risks of inaction. And we've had, I guess we've offered lessons in both. There's the risks of action, most dramatically in Iraq, but on a smaller scale in Libya, when I think the president, for perfectly understandable reasons, fearing the massacre of tens of thousands of innocent Libyans in Benghazi, with the support of some of our European allies and some of our Arab partners, decided to intervene. I understand the reasons for that, and I still think, in retrospect, it was the right thing to do. But could also, it was difficult for any of us to anticipate all the consequences that would flow from that in a place like Libya, which had been systematically stripped of institutions by Gaddafi. It's the one thing he was good at, which was, creating an entire political and social system that revolved entirely around him. And so all sorts of tribal and ethnic and sectarian conflicts grew up out of that. And, we obviously didn't do a good enough job of thinking ahead about trying to deal with all of those. And then in Syria, in some respects, you see the risk of inaction as well. And again, in the rearview mirror, steps that might have been taken a few years ago that may or may not have had a dramatic impact on the situation on the ground, but could conceivably have arrested some of the worst deterioration that we've seen.
Well, let me push a little bit on the Libya issue,
Yeah.
and not because of I understand the military intervention part and the dynamics. I was of the same mind, but if you look at it, the president, of course, has come under a lot of criticism from what people call leading from behind. Libya was probably a case like that, meaning what? Meaning that the president instinct wasn't let's lead a war effort against Libya. Let's work with our allies. Obviously, the French and others were driving the intervention far more, and the president went along and thought it was the right thing to do, obviously, but went along. But did that, when you look back at that issue and you look back at that failure, having intervened, The failure now, obviously, is what do you do after you intervene? What do you do in Libya? If you're leading from behind, you're not leading the charge, does it also make it harder for you to lead the way in doing what needs to be done in Libya after you remove Gaddafi? Was that a case where American efforts were not as centered, in part because they're part of a coalition and the US wasn't the principal driver of that decision?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, the United States, for better or worse, oftentimes doesn't have the luxury of playing a less than central role. I mean, I hate that term, leading from behind, and I honestly don't think it characterizes the president's view of his policies. But I think, I don't mean this as a statement of American arrogance at all, but I think unless the United States plays a central role, not just in what the US military does better than anybody else in military interventions, but also diplomatically and sort of thinking through how you deal with the after effects, things tend to get more complicated. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't push others to step up to their responsibilities, and sometimes it means pushing others not to do certain things too, like some of our partners in the Gulf and the support that they've provided over the years to Sunni extremists in different parts of the region. But to make that a two-way street, to get that message across to our partners, in my experience at least, the United States has to be willing to play a central diplomatic role.
So, as you know, I'm a student of this region. I've been thinking about it for a long time. I'm a student of American foreign policy, so I can't help but reflect on it in a broad sense the way you did up front.
Yeah.
And when I look at the American challenges, particularly after the Arab uprisings and what we're facing now, I can't help but notice some irony. The irony is if historically the region has accused the US for just asking them either to follow either or policies. You're either with us or against us. You can't be anywhere in between. This has been obviously true of various American administrations. It certainly was true of the Bush administration, Eisenhower administration, and many in between. And this is a critique that we heard from many. I mean, obviously, even the startup of the Third World Movement in the 1950s was in a way to resist this choice between you're either with us or against us. And now it's exactly reversed, where the region is asking us to take either or position. The Egyptian government says you're either with the Muslim Brotherhood or against us. The Arabs say you're either with Assad or against Assad. The Israelis say you're either with Iran or you're with us. And at a time when our policy wants to be more nuanced, well, we really don't want to take those clear choices, and maybe that's what's making it harder on the United States.
I mean, Shibley, as you know, consistency is an overrated virtue in the Middle East sometimes. I mean, a lot of times it's, one of the things that just comes with the territory with American leadership in the Middle East, it's not a popularity contest. And, there has to be a very rigorous view of what matters to American interests, married to a very rigorous understanding, or at least as best as we can develop an understanding of the extraordinarily complicated landscape of that region. And, sometimes we get it right, and oftentimes we don't. But back to my point about humility at the start.
Now, I want to move to the Iran file. Obviously, this is on the minds of a lot of people. In fact, I even got some emails from people who ask about Iran. And obviously, the Iran issue is very complicated, but I want to ask you first a personal question, because you obviously got involved in the conversation with Iran very early, beginning with the back channels. And could you tell us a little bit more about that, first of all? How did that happen? And what drove it?
I mean, if you take a step back on the Iranian nuclear issue, first you have to understand, as all of you know, we don't live in a perfect world. So perfect has never been on the menu in terms of what kind of an outcome you can produce on the Iranian nuclear issue. I think for the reasons I mentioned before, that preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon is an essential objective for American policy and for lots of other players in the world. The best of the available alternatives to do that is a diplomatic arrangement that's solid and verifiable and that's supported by lots of players in the international community. So the challenge when President Obama came into office beginning in 2009 is how do you get from here to there? He spent most of the first term building up leverage, because diplomacy doesn't work unless it's enabled by leverage. So by the beginning of 2013, You had an Iran whose oil exports had dropped by 50%, the value of its currency had dropped by 50%, in part because the president had used the first term both to test Iranian intentions, because we made clear we were prepared to negotiate directly for the first time, but also to use that as an investment in international support for sanctions if the Iranians proved unwilling to engage seriously, which was largely the experience of 2009 to 2013. So the question then is, you build up leverage, what do you do with it? Because leverage, like anything else in diplomacy, you get to a point where you start to lose it unless you use it. And the best way, I think, in the president's judgment to do that, again, after 35 years without sustained direct diplomatic contact with Iran, was to start quietly. The Omani government, which had preserved a healthy relationship with Iran since the revolution, offered to be a facilitator of direct, quiet talks. I think the president was right about that. I think if we had tried to conduct those talks in the glare of publicity, we would have gotten stuck very early on. The object, again, was not just between the United States and Iran to produce a comprehensive agreement. It was, since the absence of our direct contact had been a big challenge over the years, it was to use those direct contacts to try to build some momentum in negotiations so that then the bigger group, the so-called P5+1, permanent member of the Security Council plus Germany plus the EU, could finalize an agreement. So we met over the course of roughly 10 months in 2013 secretly, which is one of the things that surprised me most, in this day and age, that you can do anything quietly in the world.
So where did you meet?
In Oman, which is a discreet place, and we met. Several other meetings were at this military guest house, which was 30 minutes outside of Oman on the coast with, in 130-degree temperature, not much to do other than talk to our Iranian counterparts. And then in Europe, and then in New York, actually, of all places, where you can also have discrete meetings sometimes. And over the course of those roughly 9 or 10 sessions, we actually, especially after President Rouhani was elected beginning of 2013, made faster progress certainly than we anticipated, because I was skeptical when we started this that you could actually get anywhere. But it became clear, especially after Rouhani's election, that the Iranians with whom we were dealing were interested in a deal. We decided early on, mutually, that the best thing to aim for relatively quickly was an interim agreement that would freeze the Iranian nuclear program, roll it back in some important respects, in return for pretty modest sanctions relief. And that was basically the outcome of the back channel, but it was then consummated and completed by our with our multilateral partners, which was absolutely essential, because this was never meant to be a bilateral deal. I remember the bitter criticism of that deal. I remember the day it was signed by the ministers. Prime Minister Netanyahu said it was the deal of the century for Iran. I remember giving a copy of the headline to the senior Iranian negotiator, and saying this should help your selling job in Tehran. But it actually turned out in some respects to be a better deal for us than for the Iranians, in the sense that we didn't give a lot away in terms of sanctions relief. We preserved a lot of leverage, and we did in effect freeze their program. That was the platform then for the comprehensive negotiations that followed, and I think both the President and Secretary Kerry especially deserve great credit for that. It's controversial. Honest people can have honest concerns about elements of it. I would be the last person to suggest that it's a perfect agreement, but as I said at the start, perfect wasn't on the menu here, and the honest answer is, if, as a result of congressional pressure, the United States had walked away from that agreement, we really would have walked away alone, because this was not an agreement just between the United States and Iran. It was principal international players and Iran. And I think we could then have had the worst of all worlds, which is we walk away alone, the sanctions pressure begins to dissipate quickly, and the Iranians have an unconstrained nuclear program. Implementation of this agreement is going to be really complicated. It's not always something the US government does with great precision, and we're going to have to do it that way this time, along with our partners. And last but not least, the nuclear agreement doesn't solve all the problems or the threats posed by Iran. So it has to be embedded in a wider strategy which deals effectively with the challenge that Iran poses in lots of other parts of the Middle East. But you can tell I'm not objective about this. I think this was, clearly the best of the available alternatives to deal with this issue.
So just when I know you went in skeptically, as you do. I know you were, a tough negotiator. Everybody says so. You make it look like you're easygoing, and then you put your feet down, and everybody knows that. And so with Iran in particular, you said the Rouhani election obviously opened up a door, but as a negotiator, you're dealing with tough, Iranian negotiators. At what point did you say, now I see an opening? It could be possible. We could have a deal.
Pretty early on, our first or second encounter with the new Iranian negotiating team after Rouhani's election, I did not think that we could make progress as fast as we did on the interim deal, which was finished at the end of November of 2013. But I remember saying to a couple of my colleagues after those early discussions that it was possible to get a deal. And again, that's not because I didn't understand clearly how tough our Iranian counterparts were. I would not say that we built a trusting relationship. So I don't think trust was the issue here, although I have a lot of professional respect for their skill as diplomats and negotiators. But we tried to be just as hard-nosed in terms of ensuring that we got the kind of deal that the president asked us to get.
So the timeline, obviously, there's an opening from the Iranian side. We all have the clock ticking on the nuclear issue. The president wants to make sure that Iran doesn't develop nuclear weapons. That's really what's driving a lot of it. But wasn't there also a sense of urgency because of the prospect of war, that
Sure.
the president didn't want this issue to drag him into a war that he thought was disastrous?
Yeah, I think the president was always very clear that the object here was to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. And so he was prepared, is prepared, I believe, to use whatever means, including the use of force, to ensure that Iran did not develop a nuclear weapon. But given the fragility across the Middle East that we've seen for a decade or more, it seemed to me, at least, obviously preferable to try to produce a diplomatic outcome if you could. Diplomacy wouldn't have gotten anywhere had it not been enabled by the potential for the use of force. But I think after 9/11, to get back to your earlier question, Shibley, I think for natural human reasons, I think we fell into a habit as a country in national security of thinking about our military means, partly because the US military is so good at its job as the kind of tool of first resort, and diplomacy is what you used either to facilitate the use of force or to deal with its after effects, rather than the reverse, which is to think of diplomacy, among other tools, economic leverage, as the tool of first resort, but that has to be enabled by a strong military and the potential for the use of force. And I think, one thing that President Obama has tried hard to do is to think carefully about how you use all the instruments that he has before him.
At what point in the negotiations did you all decide that this must be entirely focused on the nuclear issue, because the others would open up a whole set of things that would be impossible to control?
It was pretty early on, and it was mutual in the sense that that was the Iranian view too, in the sense that the foreign minister and his principal deputies were empowered to deal with the nuclear issue, but not other ones. I think there was also a practical concern on our side that if you introduced a lot of other issues, they could be used as levers on the nuclear issue. We certainly took advantage of opportunities on the margins of those talks to raise really important issues like the detention of 3 or 4, Americans quite unjustly in Iran. We had opportunities to raise other issues from time to time, but I don't, again, you think of the history of US-Soviet arms control agreements, where the focus was on getting a particular nuclear limitation accomplished, and it didn't mean that we couldn't compete with one another, push back hard against one another on lots of other issues.
Now, I would like your interpretation of what you think Iran wants from the deal strategically. Obviously, we know the one thing they want, which is ending the sanctions and opening up to the international community. That's obvious, and removing the prospect of war in the short term. But beyond that, there's been a debate As you know, a lot of the Arab allies, and up to a point Israel, have felt that they want warmer relations with Iran, with the U.S. that would come at the expense of some of the regional allies, that the U.S. somehow would warm up to Iran in a new relationship. There is a different interpretation. The interpretation is that they never really thought they could have a truly warm relationship with the U.S. They saw the U.S. as an obstacle to their better relations with other countries like Russia, China, and Germany. And they're happy not to have warmer relations with the U.S. as long as they're able to do the other stuff. And so in that regard, is the increasing Iranian-Russian cooperation in Syria in part an outcome of this opening, the strategic environment that comes out of the end of the Iran deal?
I mean, I think a couple of things. I wouldn't underestimate the depth of historic mistrust between Russians and Iranians. I mean, they're competitors in many respects in energy terms. They're not natural partners. So tactically, and you certainly see it in Syria, that they'll find reason to work together. But I think, as I was saying earlier, I've never believed in an overnight transformation of U.S.-Iranian relations. There's a lot of baggage on both sides, going back many years. And I think it's important not to see Iran as a monolith on these issues. It's a big, complicated society. It's important to remember that 70% of the population of Iran was born after the revolution, under the age of 35. There's a thirst for connections, I think, especially in the younger generation, for connections with the outside world. I think it's one of the reasons that the Supreme Leader has been so skeptical of negotiations, because I think he saw in 2009, the impact that the Green Movement had, and, I think has rightfully been a little bit nervous about what happens when you open up to the outside world. So I just think we have to be realistic. I think in the short term, you're going to see very hard-nosed Iranian policies in support of Hezbollah, and we have to be equally hard-nosed in response. I think we need to ensure that Iran lives up to its obligations on the nuclear deal, and we live up to ours. And I think we have to be mindful of those long-term trend lines in Iran, which aren't going to transform Iranian behavior overnight, but I think over time are going to have an impact as that younger generation, comes more and more to the fore.
Well, so I'm going to take that now to the Syria issues. I mentioned that, and I'm going to start with, this is obviously the immediate crisis the U.S. faces, the Russian intervention, the uncertainty about what kind of outcome we can envision. But I want to ask you more a question in retrospect. You were there, when some of those critical moments were faced by the administration, decisions, tough ones. Most of us, including analysts who are sitting from the outside, often didn't know even what to recommend anymore because of the complexity of the issue. So I don't take any of that for granted. But if you look at it in retrospect, can you point to one decision or one issue, one policy, which you say, I wish we had made that decision differently, or this is a juncture we could have possibly done more to prevent the situation from getting worse?
I mean, well, there are lots of things I wish, that we could have done differently. I'm not sure if any of them would have made a dramatic impact on the ground, just because of the complexity of the Syrian issue. And I have a great deal of respect for the president's, sense of care and caution on a lot of these issues, given, what we've seen over the last decade in terms of the risks of action in other parts of the Middle East, and how easily we can miss second and third order consequences. Having said that, in Syria, I think, when you draw red lines, it becomes very difficult for the United States not to follow through on them. I think you can make a strong case that, had we moved more energetically in support of the moderate opposition earlier in the conflict, it might have made more of a difference on the ground. But I can't honestly sit here and say that I'm absolutely convinced that had we done X, Y, or Z, it would have dramatically transformed the situation. And I think we're in we and lots of other people who have a stake in stability in Syria are in, deep trouble today.
And when you look at the ISIL issue in Syria now, which obviously is a problem, the U.S. is obviously targeting ISIL. Do you see ISIL as more the son of the Iraq war or the son of the Syria war?
It's some of both. I mean, you know, it's kind of an interesting analysis to do, but I mean, I think you still end up with the same miserable outcome right now, which is, you know, a truly terrible threat to people in Iraq and Syria. And you look at the number of foreign fighters who are flocking there, many of them are going to go home sometime, and that's going to create a real security threat in parts of Europe and Russia itself and lots of other places. And you know, the Russians, I mean, Putin has commanded a lot of attention in the last couple of weeks, which what are relatively modest military deployments. And he's, you know, you have to, I suppose in a perverse way, hand it to him that he's managed to, you know, make such a big political and diplomatic splash with a military deployment that's not going to transform the situation on the ground, nor is it going to transform Russia back into a superpower. I mean, this is a country whose economy is contracting by 4% this year, that's still one-dimensional, way too, you know, dependent on oil and gas prices. But having said all that, I think he's determined to try to restore Russia as a central player in the world. I think he's got a worldview that holds that, you know, the policies of the United States are naive and indecisive and way too prone to push for changes when Americans don't understand the consequences of them. And so, you know, he wants to demonstrate that, you know, his Russia stands for a different view of the world. He wants to bolster the Assad regime, which, you know, over recent months had been losing altitude, I think. He wants, you know, I think in some ways suspicious of Iranian leverage in Damascus. He wants to reassert Russia's role. So if there ever is any serious diplomatic process that, you know, Russia's established its position at center stage. He doesn't mind sticking a thumb in the eye of the United States. You know, he tends to have a pretty zero-sum view of the world still. And he doesn't mind trying to change the channel, you know, change the subject from Ukraine at a time when he hopes very much to drive wedges amongst the members of the European Union and get them to ease sanctions that were produced as a result of Russian aggression in Ukraine. So, you know, complicated set of motives. I mean, I think Putin, you know, is a very adept opportunist in lots of ways, and he's demonstrated that now. And you know, he's managed to grab the headlines and put Russia back at center stage in a way that it hasn't been in the Middle East for a long time. I don't know that he can sustain that. I don't think making a bet on Bashar al-Assad right now is a very smart strategy over time. And he certainly alienated lots of, you know, Sunni Arabs in the meantime. But in the short term, he's gotten people's attention.
I know that you know Putin because you were the ambassador there when he was president last time, and you had to work with him. Mm-hmm. So are you in agreement with the president's assessment that he's getting himself into a quagmire in Syria, that he's operating?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I don't think it's a smart strategic bet for Russia. I mean, you know, 30 years ago, you know, Russia got itself into some pretty difficult predicaments in Afghanistan. And at a moment, you know, when Russia's suffering from lots of other domestic challenges as well. But having said that, I mean, I think people are far too prone to be dismissive of Russia as a declining power. Declining powers can be just as disruptive and complicated to deal with as rising powers. And I think you see evidence of that in the Middle East, where the danger, as I said before, is not so much that, you know, Putin's actions are either going to transform the military landscape in Syria or turn Russia back into a superpower. Neither of those things are going to happen. But what they can do is dig away further at what's left of order in the Middle East. I think it can make a bad situation in Syria worse. And I think it can further erode, you know, people's sense of an American-led order in the Middle East as well. And none of those are good things either.
I'm going to turn to the audience in a bit, so please have your questions ready. We're going to have microphones. People will bring the microphone to you when I call on you shortly. But I'm going to end up with a couple of quick questions. Maybe not so quick because they're broad, but one of them is on the refugee issue. I mean, this is one of the huge tragedies right now that everybody's facing. I mean, forget the geopolitics for a minute. I mean, it is extraordinary. it's a global problem, but obviously what we face from the Middle East is unbelievable. I've heard numbers like we're having, since 2014, we've been having 40,000 new refugees every single day or something like that. That is on a magnitude that strains everyone. So I wonder whether you have any thoughts, just at all, on whether there's anything we could do to help. I mean, we as the United States of America, whether this could be strategic or just simply humanitarian, whether the issue is absorbing more refugees or encouraging other countries to do so, or whether there should be a safe haven in Syria, or what do you think would be the wise course?
Well, it's probably something of all of the above, in the sense that I think American leadership is important in terms of taking in refugees and looking at ways in which we can take in substantially larger number of refugees in the world. I think what American society has been about for many years has been to be open to people who are displaced in the world. Obviously you got to go through very careful security procedures, but I think if you want to get others to do more, either to encourage them or shame them into doing more, it's important for the United States to look at ways in which we can as well. Second, there's huge expense. The U.S. is already the single biggest contributor to sort of refugee funds and international institutions that deal with refugees, but we need to push harder for others to do more on those issues. And finally, the only ultimate solution here is to anchor people in a sense of somewhat greater order, stability, and possibility in Syria. And that gets back to the issue of safe havens. I do think it's worth looking seriously at safe havens, maybe first in the south of Syria on the Jordanian border, because for two reasons. First, I think it can help address the immediate humanitarian crisis. And second, because I think if you look at how you enable diplomacy, much as the Russians have done with their military deployment, it sometimes is extremely important for the United States to, assert some leadership and use that to mobilize others into acting. I understand all the downsides of safe zones. It's easy, especially for people like me now outside government, to offer cheap advice. But I do think there's an argument in both humanitarian terms and in terms of enabling diplomacy for thinking about that.
Great. One final question, which is broader. So in January 2017, we're going to have a new president. And just if you look ahead and knowing what we're facing now, will the next president be more or less engaged in the Middle East? And I mean engaged in always, I don't mean diplomatically, I mean, are we going to be more stuck in the Middle East, or are we going to be more out of the Middle East?
Well, setting aside the Trump administration, which I can't predict, as I was saying at the outset, Shibley, I think it's really important for the United States to rebalance our priorities and focus more energy and resources on the Asia Pacific, just as one example, because the sort of future of the global economy lies more in that direction. But I also do not think we have the luxury during the tenure of the next president of ignoring the Middle East either, because the fragility in the Middle East doesn't stay there. It spills over outside. Yeah, and the second kind of rebalance, though, that I think we ought to work harder at is how do you rebalance the tools that we use? Because as I said before, sometimes we've been prone to the sort of early use of military tools. They're still going to be really important. They're still essential tools in dealing with ISIS and and other terrorist groups. But I think a focus on diplomacy, a focus on some of those longer-term drivers of instability in the Middle East in terms of modernizing economies is also going to be important for a new administration to keep an eye on.
Well, thanks very much. Let's open it up for questions. Garrett Mitchell first, and then we'll take two questions at a time. Carla is next. So we'll have two questions at a time, if you don't mind. Does that work?
Sure. I can't remember more than two, so yeah. Hi.
Thanks very much. I'm Garrett Mitchell,
Hi.
and I write the Mitchell Report. And I want to go back to the sort of opening scenario that Professor Telhami talked about, which is the opportunity of having you here to help people, particularly students at the university, think about American foreign policy and how it gets made and how it functions and how it dysfunctions. And I was thinking about, Ambrose Bierce's famous observation about Americans learn their geography when they go to war, which raises the question of whether we learn much else when we go to war. And if we think about the wars that you have seen over your time, 33 years, it raises a question for me that I'd be interested in your perspective about. And that is it that we often lack, I'm talking institutionally, that we lack enough understanding or knowledge of the region in question or the issue in question? Or is it a factor of domestic politics that really drives policy? And understanding that, you know, both those factors are at play, I'm interested in your observations over a long period of time about the relative influence and impact of those two, and whether you've seen any shift in that regard during your time in office.
I guess of the two factors.
We take another one,
oh,
another question,
sorry.
and then.
I was thinking of two.
So if you can, Carla.
Sure.
And
Hi.
Hi. My name is Carla Abdo. I'm a doctoral candidate at the Department of Government and Politics, focusing on Middle Eastern politics.
get the microphone closer.
Up here?
Yeah. Better.
Thank you. The Arab Gulf states have been very quiet in terms of dealing with the Syrian refugee crisis and have not been super friendly in terms of opening up their borders and, you know, including people in this type of thing. What is your analysis of that, and how does that also reflect in the long-term consequences of dealing with Syrian refugees and then hopefully with the right of return later on?
I'll start with that question and then come back to yours, Garrett. I think, you know, the root of it is a sense of insecurity at home and a concern about what you do with, you know, lots of other populations when they're worried about domestic security. That's not an excuse for, you know, not at least making significantly greater financial contributions, whether it's to UN agencies dealing with refugees or, you know, other non-governmental agencies doing this, or doing even more to support countries like Jordan or Lebanon, which are, you know, going to drown. I mean, literally, a quarter of the population of Lebanon today are Syrian refugees, 20% of the population of Jordan. So I understand, even if I don't entirely accept the reasons for not wanting to take in large numbers, but there are other ways in which, you know, Gulf states could contribute. Now, in fairness, some, you know, have been stepping up, but others could do more, I think. Gary, in response to your question, the sort of two factors that you mentioned and what changes I've seen over those 33 years. I mean, I guess on the second factor, sort of domestic politics, you know, I've seen periods, we all sit around the Situation Room in the White House and complain to each other that things have never been rougher than they are now. And the truth is, you know, I've seen periods in which domestic political dysfunction and debate within administrations were pretty sharp. But I do think it's got increasingly difficult to build that kind of bipartisan sense of how you deal with big foreign policy problems. And I think that domestic dysfunction does make a difference in foreign policy. It's really hard to mobilize coalitions overseas when you clearly can't mobilize them at home. So I think that trend line has gotten tougher, and it does come, I think, at the expense oftentimes of more effective American foreign policy. And I hope very much as you look into the next election cycle that sometime we can, recover the missing bipartisan gene, or at least parts of it, because it does undermine our ability overseas. On the first issue, our grasp, as a government of realities overseas, I mean, we learn something new all the time, and so it's an imperfect grasp. I look at the people, young Foreign Service officers coming into the State Department, and actually I'm glad I didn't have to compete against them when I came in 35 years ago or so, because, in terms of language ability, experience overseas, and understanding that they bring into the diplomatic service of how the world works, it's pretty impressive. Now, different governments don't always make the best use of that resource, but I think the basic skill sets are there. We have to keep investing in them because, language ability, the ability to navigate foreign societies are still extraordinarily important. And, you know, some people are dismissive of the role of embassies these days, saying that in the, you know, a world transformed by technology, they don't matter much. I am old school in my view of that. I think having people on the ground who have a real feel for how, you know, how to navigate landscapes is extraordinarily important.
Yes, please, and then Dana.
Hi.
We have a second microphone. Maybe you could get it over, please. And give him the other one.
There you go.
Okay.
Two quick ones. I know you're concerned about the lack of support for Tunisia. So what are your thoughts on how we can step up and support the one bright, shining success story of the last 4 years? And second question is the fate of R2P. R2P was one of the justifications for Libya, and it sort of died with the widespread perception that it was badly used and couldn't be used again. So I was wondering what you think about the future of R2P or something like R2P to protect civilian populations there right now in Syria. 34,000 have died from barrel bombs.
Yes.
There's a pretty good R2P argument that can be made, so I wondered what your thoughts are on that.
Dana, if you can, Dana right here. No, Dana, and then later afterwards. Dana is next. Dana is next, yeah.
Sorry.
Thank you. I'm Dana Priest from the School of Journalism.
Hi.
And my question was actually a follow-up on the very last thing you said about tools. I certainly agree that we're in imbalance right now, but if you look at how the United States is responding to countries that are kicking out our pro-democracy tools, we don't seem like we're putting up any fuss about that. Both in Egypt and Bahrain, in Russia, in other parts of the Middle East, they say we will take your military dollars, but we're not taking your pro-democracy, civil society building dollars anymore. And it seems like we're just saying, okay, am I missing something? Are we going to be able to even right that imbalance?
And yeah, we'll go with that. And then
No, it's a really good question. I'll come back to that. On Tunisia, I agree with you. I mean, I think, you know, in a region right now that doesn't have a lot of sort of rays of light, I think Tunisia is one of them. I don't think people should take for granted the success of Tunisia's post-revolutionary experiment, but one important thing has emerged there, and that is, at least so far, people and leaders have figured out that you've got to compromise politically to get any place. For them to succeed, they've got to deliver things economically and socially to people. I think what's really important is for Tunisians to continue to demonstrate their commitment to do their part, and then for the United States, the EU, Gulf Arab states, everybody who has a stake in the success of that model, looking at ways in which we can reinforce that. So in effect, you have a kind of compact that's drawn up in which everybody has a role. And I think there's a sense of urgency about that in Tunisia too. And this is a free advertisement for Carnegie, my new institution, but we actually have just launched a program focused on Tunisia, which trying to do some of those things, or at least help do them. On right to protect, I think notwithstanding all the very hard lessons that were learned in Libya and elsewhere and are still being learned every day, I don't think that should undermine that concept. What I think it means is that people need to look more honestly at what it takes to make it work effectively, not just in terms of a military intervention, but the what comes after part. And Libya illustrates to this day, a lot of the failings of all of us in looking at those kind of questions. Danny, it's a really good question. And I'm out of government now, but I don't think people are sort of rolling over on those issues. I mean, I think, the closing space for civil society is pretty obvious in lots of parts of the world. Lots of regimes now are kind of imitating one another and coming up with more and more draconian NGO laws. I think there are lots of creative ways of getting around that and providing support to, groups of people who desperately need it in those societies. And here I'm not talking about picking sides politically in different societies. That's always what we're accused of. We're looking to foment the next color revolution. But there are lots of people who are animated by either it's a resentment of corruption or a concern about environmental issues who can benefit from connections to other groups around the world. those are issues that it's more difficult for regimes to wall people off from. So I just think we need to be more creative, more persistent in trying to help people push back against that closing of space for civil society, because it's really hard to see. It gets back to that point about pluralism I was making before. It gets really hard to see a more hopeful future for many of those societies unless you see that respect for pluralism.